A hero in your own hometown, and all they give you is a bathroom.
Yeah, well, you know.
How's that work
If
exactly?
anybody needs to go to the Kirk, go now.
The Kirk. I think there is something just awesome about them referring to the bathroom as the Kirk.
Well,
I just think that's so great.
My parents would be very, very proud.
They sure would. All that hard work for
That's
this.
right.
Let's begin with the news of yesterday. So yesterday, you know, the state leaders, the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker, announced the results of their budget-cutting exercise. They had asked back in January state agencies to cut their budgets by 5%. The total cuts submitted, we know, were $1.7 billion, but they made some exemptions for things like hospital beds and Homeland Security and all that, and they got down to $1.2 billion. You told Kate Alexander of the Statesman today, or for today's paper, that the era of something for nothing has now been shown to be ridiculous. Could you talk a little bit about your view of that?
Yeah, I think you need to kind of put it in overall context.
Yeah.
Look, we're in a mess.
Yeah.
This budget cycle, I mean, it is a big mess. I hear people trying to minimize it all the time.
Yeah.
They minimize it by saying, it's just a simple math problem, or, we'll just tighten our belt, or something like that. But it's a mess both procedurally and actually.
Yeah.
Part of it is, right now, people can't even tell you how deep the hole is. We know we can't see the bottom of it, but we don't know where that is. And I find that, both from a procedural standpoint and an actual standpoint, a real problem.
Why is that? We still don't know some things that will ultimately tell us the size of the hole, right?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I also think it's part of the process that we follow that I think is symptomatic of what we saw with this little round that we went through of so-called budget cuts. And part of the problem is that we don't have a process set up. I mean, we're a $180+ billion enterprise that meets once every 2 years, and we sprint to try to get a budget passed. But during the rest of that time, we're not doing some of the very things that ought to be done to keep people up to date on it. So that, for example, what you have is a process that was created with this 5% situation, where the big three say, hey, we're going to do cuts. Now, there's no real process to that. There's no real public input to that. There's really almost no legislative input to that. And so what happens is, we don't even know what the values are that go into making those decisions.
Why should there be public input, frankly? Why should there be legislative input? The agency heads are responsible for their budgets. They're asked to cut 5%. They submit 5% cuts. Why is that not the appropriate way to go at that?
Well, because, for a variety of reasons, but let's start with this. You've got a budget that ought to be the basis of the values of our state.
Right.
So if you're going to come in and you're going to start making cuts, and by the way, let me start off by saying this. I think a process of always knowing where your first 5% is going to come is a very good process. I think that in good times and bad times, it is appropriate and something we ought to do is know how much and where we might first make cuts. But we ought to do that based upon some sort of value proposition. And my value proposition would be first and foremost, and this actually, frankly, is my value proposition in looking at budgets where you're doing anything. But it ought to be, people first. How are we going to invest in Texans? And by the way, the flip side of that, of course, is what are we going to cut? But how are we going to invest in Texans so that we move forward? Everything from early childhood all the way through higher ed. What's the metrics that we will use to determine whether we're getting any form of return on investment, cuts or otherwise, revenue or cuts or whatever? How do we make sure it's transparent? How do we make sure that those who are elected to help make the decisions on behalf of people know what's going on? And frankly, how do the people know what's going on? And then I think, so that you can also have some transparency and accountability in there. And then the other thing about it is we ought to be looking at how it is we can assure that we have some sort of reliability to balancing the budget. We're in this mess, in my view, because for too long, our budgeting process has been based upon what I call the 3 Ds of budgeting: debt, diversions, and delay. We're using far more debt than we were using even a decade ago. And in fact, and transportation being a big part of that.
Which we'll come to.
Yeah, a decade ago, we were pay as you go. but we're not that way. Diversions, there's a whole lot that goes on where in the budgeting process where taxpayers think they're giving money for something and they expect to get something in return for those tax dollars, but the money gets spent on something else. And then delay. And the delay is that over and over again, it's about how we can kick the can down the road, how we can avoid making the kinds of decisions that have been promised to the taxpayers. And of course, the best example of that, I guess, is really twofold. One is the 2006 so-called budget tax swap, where there was a property tax cut and it was supposed to be replaced by the so-called business tax or margins tax, whatever you want to call it. And the other is the use of stimulus money. And so that delays making the hard decisions.
Well, the lieutenant governor said last week in this very room that he didn't believe it required stimulus money to balance the budget. He disagrees with you that the stimulus was a delay tactic. Have I set that softball in front of you high enough on an arc there?
Well, I guess coulda, woulda, shoulda, you know.
Is he wrong?
Well, I suppose I could be playing in an NBA Finals right now if I weren't 4 foot tall, you know. So here's what happened. Here's what happened. There's no denying that billions of dollars of stimulus money, depending upon who you listen to, you know, around $12 billion of stimulus money was used to balance that budget. About $6.4 billion of it was money that everybody seems to be willing to admit, everybody seems to be willing to admit, directly replaced general revenue. The rest of that money, that stimulus money, went for what some say are one-time programs. I think the old mayor in me sees that as really expanding your base budget, but I'll even go along with that argument. It was balanced, 6.4 of that, or roughly 6.4, around that neighborhood, was used to directly offset general revenue. There were many of us pointing out that is what we're doing here. So it's hard to
And that's
say.
not going to be available this time.
It's not going, unless somebody thinks that Washington's really looking to help Texas this next time. I can't imagine that that's going to be available. Yeah.
You don't think?
Yeah. That red phone on the governor's desk, I'm not sure is going to
Not gonna
ring.
ring.